been with for 16 years, previously serving as a district manager in the Environmental Health Bureau. Prior to coming to the Environment Department, he worked in local government, overseeing public works, maintenance, operations, and construction. Before entering the public service, he worked in environmental remediation of numerous listed CERCA sites around the United States as a health and safety professional and project manager for an engineering consulting firm out of Utah. Welcome, John.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you. Pleasure to be here. I'll try and pay attention to if this thing decides to lock up again so that we can react to it right away. I appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you folks here in the room and also online tonight. As was said, I'm the director of the Water Protection Division at New Mexico Environment Department. And the four bureaus that I have, groundwater, surface water, drinking water, and construction programs, are ultimately responsible for all water across the state. Pretty much if it's wet, it's ours. And we are tasked with protecting the most important resource in the state, which is water. Because without water, we don't have anything. And there is a lot of conversation out there. I like to say that last year the legislative session was pretty wet because we talked about all things water. This is gearing up the same way because people are waking up to the fact that, you know, we've been in drought, we are in drought, and it's not going to get any better anytime soon. And so appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. Let me see if I can get this to go ahead. See what I need to just share my screen. Okay. All right, there we go. I love it when it works right. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move past this one because this is just the same information we talked about. I want to talk with you tonight about a lot of the water challenges that we face and then some specifics because I know that there were questions and issues about what has transpired and what is the impact of the recent Sackett versus EPA ruling by the Supreme Court. I like to put this picture up. It reminds me of how nice it can be in New Mexico, but it's also a reminder that things change really fast. You know, 3 weeks ago, we had so much water in the Rio Grande, we didn't know what to do with it. Last week, we're trying to figure out how to save the Silvery Minnow again because it dried up. And that's the new reality we deal with. We get rainy weather, and I'm hoping what we're seeing now is going to stick around for a few days. We need that slow, long-term rain to recharge aquifers and to help. But the reality is that our current condition.
No, it's certainly because nobody wants to do anything. In order for me to get them to do something, I have to help out. So
Not sure what we're hearing.
Well, I have to go into the participants. We've said that.
well, he said he has some possibilities. He's always busy with other things. He has some other possibilities, but
So some of the challenges I want to talk about
back to me and said I found
are extended and drenched out, intense drought conditions. We don't lose our network here. and then regulatory uncertainty. So how are we addressing those challenges? Well, the Environment Department has embarked on developing water reuse regulations that include direct and indirect potable reuse, which we probably know better as the toilet to tap concept. If you remember from years back, there was a lot of talk about doing that, recycling the wastewater to drink. It's done quite a bit in California. It's much more accepted now than it used to be, but we're looking at that direct and indirect potable reuse, expanded reclaimed wastewater use, and we see a lot of it. Interestingly enough, New Mexico leads most of the nation in reclaimed water waste use. About 45% of all the wastewater generated in the state, and I'm talking about from your municipal wastewater treatment plants, city treatment plants and stuff, is treated and then reused to water golf courses and ornamental vegetation, medians and things like that. But we can expand that as well. Commercial gray water use is something that is currently not allowed. In the state of New Mexico, the regulations allow you as a residential property owner to reuse gray water on your property for irrigating plants. You can't use it on your garden, but you can irrigate plants with it, things like that. But it's not allowed for our large commercial users. And so there's a water resource that goes right down the sewer that we think there's a mechanism to capture. Treated produced water from oil and gas production. We are looking at that right now. We're developing regulations that prohibit the discharge of just produced water, treated produced water. Quite honestly, because it's pretty nasty stuff. Once they get done utilizing it, for every barrel of oil that they produce somewhere between 7 and 15 barrels of water. And that water has oil in it, it has other things in it. Depending on where in the state it comes from, the quality is much better or much worse, but it's not something that we want to utilize and risk contaminating our other water supplies, groundwater and surface water with. So the rulemakings we're looking at address the use of that in closed loop industrial applications, somewhere where it can be used, never discharged, there's no human contact. It can be managed safely and then back into the oil fields, right? When it's done, re-injected. We're also looking at desalination, brackish water reuse, okay? And again, these are all big topics that were in the legislature last year, which was good because I went from not having any money to address reuse to the legislature giving us 2.9 million to start this process. Now that sounds like a lot. It's really not, but it gets us moving. Little note on desal. There's a lot of what we call brackish water in the state. Okay, that's water that's saltier than seawater, but doesn't exceed 10,000 parts per million total dissolved solids. Well, there's a lot of it in the state, but to treat it is expensive, and you wind up with a slurry that you got to dispose of. Now, if you're on one of the coasts, that's not a problem, right? Because you treat it and you put the slurry back in the ocean. But if you're in the middle of New Mexico, that's a little bit tougher, right? So what do you do? And how do you deal with that? Because it's so salty, you can't use it for anything else. Where do you dispose of it? Those are the kinds of things we're working with communities, we're working with environmental groups, we're working with industry to figure out how to solve this. We've engaged with Israel because they do a lot of desalination over there. Again, though, their position, if you look where they're at, they have bodies of water they can discharge to. State of Texas has a big desal plant down in El Paso, but the only reason that they can do it there is because they are able to pipe the water onto a military base that has a deep injection well and put it back into the ground. And of course, injection comes with its own problems. You may have heard about the little issues with earthquakes, down in West Texas and eastern New Mexico due to injection. That's one of the reasons, though, they're looking at other options for using this produced water so they don't have to inject it, produce that volume. And then direct aquifer recharge, taking water, treating it and putting it back into the aquifers so that it can be reused down the road. And that's kind of the difference between direct and indirect potable reuse. Direct potable reuse is where I would take the wastewater from the wastewater treatment plant, treat it, clean it up to a level that the drinking water treatment plant could treat to make it safe, and then putting it right back into the pipes for you to take out of your tap. The second piece, the indirect, which is more what we're in favor of, involves an environmental buffer. And we've actually got one of these going on now, well, two of them. Albuquerque does it, Rio Rancho has an injection system where they treat their wastewater, they put it back into the ground, but it has this underground aquifer to work through that also helps clean it up. A lot of challenges, but a lot of opportunities. And of course, we're charged with protecting the existing surface and groundwater sources. We're responsible for developing, and we are right now working on a New Mexico surface water permitting system. And so I will say, and as we get to talk more about the second piece, it didn't throw us off our game very much because we were already working on a state permitting system when that happened. Because we've seen the problem whenever, the government changes the definition of WOTUS, which is waters of the United States, and what they protect, it impacts us. And we'll look more in depth at that. But we're actively pursuing a state permitting system. Now, to kind of explain what that's about, there's a difference. There's two pieces to it, okay? There's the one piece that most people think we ought to go after, which is called primacy. That's where we have a program that allows us to take over responsibility from the EPA for issuing National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permits, or NIPDES permits, as we call it, which is for big dischargers. City of Albuquerque has one, City of Santa Fe has one, because they discharge directly into a water of the United States, into the Rio Grande. Okay, and so that's part of what we want to do. But that doesn't protect the bulk of the water in the state of New Mexico or the bulk of the water courses, because they don't fit the definition of WOTUS, okay, waters in the US. So our first phase is developing a program that protects everything outside of that definition of WOTUS. And then we go after primacy, because EPA can't give up, they can't not permit that stuff until somebody takes it over. So that's just a little precursor on what we're doing. We're working on enhancing our groundwater protection regs. It's critical that we develop training programs for operators, because one of the big problems in the state of New Mexico now is that we have about 70% of our water and wastewater systems serve communities that have less than 1,000 people in it. All right. And those communities, most of them cannot afford to hire operators. They can't afford to hire administrative staff. So the board that oversees those systems are all volunteers. And much like me, they're not getting any younger. And young people don't know about what's going on and aren't getting involved. And so we have a big effort that we've started to reach out. Matter of fact, I was just reviewing materials that we're going to be reaching out at the high school level to help kids understand that there's a whole field of work out here that they can get into and create that path. We're already working with universities, but it's difficult. And the other piece is, of course, the communities can't necessarily afford to pay these people. Right? And so that becomes a problem. And that's something we're working with the legislature now and in this upcoming session to do, is look at ways to fund that, to come up with some kind of a program, kind of like a co-op that communities could join and they could pay into based on what their capabilities are. And then the co-op would pay for those operators, because what we're doing now isn't working. And a system that can't be operated correctly is detrimental to all of us, because it's either wasting water or it's putting out water that's going to contaminate our groundwater supplies. I tell people all the time, we live in a fishbowl, right? What happens on one side of New Mexico affects what happens on the other side of New Mexico. And in fact, around the world, what happens it affects us all because there's no getting out of this fishbowl, right? And it's all ultimately connected. So we're working at doing that, and that's where this last bullet, water and wastewater system regionalization. Figuring out how to share resources between these systems. Now, sometimes when I say regionalization, systems think, oh, you mean we got to connect all our piping so we're all sharing. Well, sometimes that works and sometimes that makes sense, but not always. What does make sense is regionalizing the support services so that 3 or 4 small communities can go together to hire the engineers they need to do designs, to hire operators that can run multiple systems, that can hire an administrator that can handle the books for those systems, right? And share those resources. So there's a big education component to it. Now, we'll start talking a little bit about the regulatory uncertainty, and that's where the decision of Sackett versus EPA comes in. It's not the first time we've dealt with this. The definition of waters of the US, or WOTUS, has shifted several times over the last couple of administrations. Yes,
Is it Sackett 2023 or the first Sackett go around?
it's the second one.
Okay.
Yeah, the one that just recently happened is where EPA or the Supreme Court, or SCOTUS, right? And I love all the alphabet soup we get to deal with in these jobs. Ruled that the way EPA had tried to apply the definition of waters of the US to the Sackett property was inappropriate. Now, let me say, they were only talking about that specific piece of property, but it informed the definition of how, or the interpretation of how the WOTUS, the waters of the US, is applied, right? And basically what it came down to was the Supreme Court said there had to be a physical surface connection between a confirmed water of the US and a wetland in order for that protection to be extended to the wetland. All right, so if there was a roadway or there was dry land in between, they didn't consider them connected and therefore couldn't be protected under the definition of waters of the US. Now in New Mexico, and to be quite honest, most water folks that know anything about it disagree with that because there is a connection between surface water and groundwater. And sometimes you can't see it, but it's there. In this case, Supreme Court said, no, if you can't physically see this connection, if you can't determine where one stops and the other starts, then you can't protect it. Okay. So that was a huge issue. And that has caused, obviously, repercussions. EPA just came out with modifications to the definitions and how they're going to apply it based on what the Supreme Court said. And again, this is why I'll go back to the reason we made the decision to kind of shift direction and not worry about going after primacy so that we could enforce the definition of the waters of the US. Because I can't redefine waters of the US, I have to go with their definition. So if I have primacy right now, nothing's protected outside that narrow definition. So we made the determination we need to worry about protecting everything else and then come back to primacy. Likely it's going to happen about the same time. It's not a rapid process, but we felt like we needed to protect New Mexico first. Right, and in such a manner that going forward, it won't matter what the definition of WOTUS is. Our state regulations will shift to make sure that everything is covered. So that's and the other piece is there's still some confusion. You know, there's parts of the WOTUS definition that talk about navigable waters, but it doesn't really define a navigable water. Okay. Well, depending on the time of year, even though the Rio Grande is considered a water of the US, it's not navigable, right? So at what point does that become an issue? So, you know, under Obama, under that era, the Clean Water Rule, what we call the significant nexus. which is the idea that if we could show that there is a connection between groundwater and the surface water, right, it could be protected. Then under the Trump era, it changed and they looked at Justice-Scalia's relatively permanent concept, which basically said if the water comes and goes, it shouldn't be protected. Well, folks, that's most of New Mexico,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly.
Which is why that's when, like I say, we started a few years ago working on the process of developing our regulations. Because none of this worked. We can't protect New Mexico with this kind of unknown going on, right? I pretty much a sure thing operator. I want it locked down where I know what I can do. So we're moving forward with that rulemaking. And so there's been quite a history of this. 2023, as I said, was when the Supreme Court emphasized, they leaned more on the relatively permanent test. And then they pushed on this issue of, as it says, a practical matter that the waters are indistinguishable. You can't tell where the river stops and the wetland starts, right? It's one constant surface across there. Even though that most of your high school students understand that you can have water and you can have a road in the middle of it and the water moves together, right? It's connected, but for whatever reason, this is where it landed, okay? And so it makes it difficult, that continuous surface connection. Now, let's talk specifically about New Mexico. About 7% of our waters, our surface waters, are considered perennial, which means they're there year round, right? They function, they run year round to some extent. That includes the Rio Grande, and like I say, it's questionable now. As a kid growing up over on the west side of the state, I learned pretty quick that just because it looked like the Rio Puerco was dry didn't mean that it was. If you dug down 6 inches, you had running water below the surface. If you stepped in the right spot, you were pretty much swimming. It was a little muddy, but you were swimming because while it looked one way, the water had just dropped. So 93% of the waters, surface waters in our state, then are considered non-perennial, right? They don't run all the time. That's, to give you an idea, that's 88,810 river miles out of a total of 95,172. Now that picks up, you know, rivers, it picks up streams, it picks up some water courses that are dry most of the year, but they run. And because they run, they need to be protected. Why? Because, to be quite honest, just like flushing the toilet, you get that torrential rain up the canyon, it's going to wash whatever's in the canyon down. And so those need to be protected from discharges, from contamination going into them, so that it doesn't get washed down and hit the Rio Grande, hit waters that are used in some cases as drinking water sources, okay? And again, a lot of our perennial streams and rivers are interrupted, so we're not sure that the Clean Water Act protections are going to apply all the time, depending on interpretation, right? And the interpretations depend on what's the next lawsuit. Okay. Many of our water sources are used as drinking water sources for communities. Some are totally dependent on surface water. Northern New Mexico, you know, city of Las Vegas, Chama, some of those communities, they get all their drinking water from a surface water source. So if it becomes contaminated, they have a problem. And we saw this on a major level with the big fires, the Calf Canyon and Hermit's Peak fires last year, because they contaminated the flow, they contaminated the reservoirs that the community draws their water from, and their water treatment system couldn't handle the ash flow. And there was a period of time there where they were literally, I'll say this, they do a good job as a community when it comes to stuff like that, of restricting use to get by. There was a point where they were limiting water use in that community to 40 gallons per person per day, which is not much. All right, and they were strictly enforcing that. Now, they didn't have a hard time enforcing because, like I said, the community got behind it. But part of the goal and part of our job is to figure out, working with them, how do we make them more resilient so that that doesn't hit them like that again, right? And so they're one of the communities looking at water reuse and indirect potable reuse to augment their drinking water supply. Reuse will never replace your primary water supply, but it can extend its life. It can extend the amount. So we're actively looking at that with the city. They're investing a lot of their own money, trying to help us get these regs in place, trying to stand up a test pilot project to see if they can make this work, to prevent their community having to go through this again, right? And, you know, last Friday, we had another fire pop up right near the house. I mean, it's not if we're gonna have another one, it's when we're gonna have another one, because even with significant rain, we're not out of the drought. It's kind of like I said earlier, the Rio Grande 3 weeks ago had more water in it than we knew what to do with. Communities were concerned about it releasing so much it was going to blow out their dikes downstream. And this last week, they're having to figure out how to get water from other places to keep the silvery minnows alive because it dried up through Albuquerque. Right? So, and that's a big part of the problem. That's why I like getting out in the community and talking to people, because it's that feast or famine mentality. It's a problem today, but as soon as the river's running full tomorrow, I'm not worried about this. Right? Until the next day when it dries up. And then the question is, why didn't we do something here? And this is, you know, this is working with our legislators. And New Mexico is unique because we have unpaid volunteer legislators, which is a whole nother thing to work with, right? There's really good things and there's really bad things. And we've got some really good legislators, and we've got some that are not as invested maybe as you would like them to be. But the issue becomes, they're still just like everybody sitting here, right? And so I spend a significant amount of time, as do my other coworkers, in managing expectations and setting realities and trying to keep the focus where it needs to be. The fact that it's raining today does not mean you need to not work on funding us for the longer term. Today's a good day. Tomorrow probably won't be, so we need that long-term support, and that is difficult, very difficult to keep in front of people. It's tough to keep in front of the public. You know, most people don't want to hear about the water problem until they turn their faucet on and nothing comes out, and then there's a problem, right? Then they want to know. We run into situations where communities don't want to take and do the hard things to make themselves more resilient. You know, they don't want to necessarily spend the money to do an upgrade that will help them down the road. And sometimes they get upset with me because they feel like I'm being harsh. And I always tell them, you know, the toughest job in the world is protecting people from themselves. And sometimes my job is to protect the public from complacency. Right? Not a popular thing most of the time, but necessary. So, you know, we, as I say, we're committed to getting a surface water permitting program in place. The time frame, and we'll talk about more facts about the water, even though we've been working on it, we're anticipating that it's going to be in FY25, in 2025, when we go before the legislature to get the support from them to start the program, and then to develop the regulations. We go to the Water Quality Control Commission. They have to adopt those regulations. So we're about on course for that. Between now and 2025, we're ramping up a lot of public outreach. We're going to be doing public service announcements. We're going to be doing meetings. We're going to do some video stuff. We're going to do outreach to groups, to communities. We need to build support for this, right? And here's why. Because we're talking about expanding the regulated community, right? Under a state program, we're going to be talking to people and needing to permit them that they've never been before. That never plays well, but it's necessary. This is one of those necessary evils, if you will, that I don't like it. But I recognize that if we don't do this in 20 years, a lot of our communities won't be here. You know, on the east side of the state, Roswell, Clovis, they get their water exclusively from the Ogallala Aquifer, which runs under eastern New Mexico, West Texas, into Oklahoma. As a kid, I grew up on a farm in West Texas, and we used a deep irrigation well. And I remember as a kid when we had to sink that well deeper because it quit producing water. That was coming out of the Ogallala. And that was more years ago than I want to talk about, that it was already dropping. The most recent estimate is that the Ogallala Aquifer in the Roswell and Clovis area will be gone in 10 years. Gone. It'll be to the point they can't use it. And we've got Roswell now is in a bind because most of their water wells are sucking sand because the water table has dropped. So they're having to look at what do we do? And they can go deeper, but the reality is that aquifer is going to go away. So, you know, there's funding out there now for an eastern New Mexico pipeline. They're looking at building a pipeline from Colorado and also from Texas to pipe that water in for those communities. But you're talking about a lot of water volume, and you're talking about something that's going to cost money, right? But it's the only option. And unfortunately, in those areas, it's too late to turn it around. I mean, we've looked at how do you stop this? And the answer is you just can't.
Well, would water be appropriated then? I mean, isn't it all over appropriated?
Well, that's part of the problem, is that when you talk about water quantity, which is the state engineer's office, I get to deal with the quality piece, but the reality is we don't have a good idea of exactly what we're working with as far as groundwater across the state. Now, legislature recognized that, state engineer recognized that, and so last session, they provided a lot of funding to the state engineer to begin working, and they're actually working with New Mexico Tech, with the geology bureau down there, to map all the groundwater across the state. Some of it was done, but we recognize we have huge gaps. So that's happening. And that's going to help us figure out some of the answers to this. It's also going to probably confirm some of the things we are pretty sure we know. And not all of the information is going to be good. And part of setting expectations with communities is, even if we come up with alternatives, like even doing water reuse, you may have to consider that what the conditions and lifestyle you have today may not be maintainable over the long term, right? That's a hard truth. But I'm dad to 5 kids, and I've got 11 grandkids, and I learned somewhere in that frickin' process that it doesn't do them any favors not to share the truth with you, not to help them be grounded in reality. And not doing that, and we see a lot of that at the state and the federal levels, at local levels. We don't want to deal with the realities. I call that the ostrich syndrome, right? Stick your head in the sand. The problem is it leaves other important pieces exposed, and it doesn't change the problem. So it's not a quick fix, but I will say that in probably the last 6 years, the emphasis and the recognition that we've got to do something, we've got to address this, has really changed and has come up. You know, right now the state engineer's office is actively engaged in reviewing the regional water plans. All right, and those plans deal with how do we protect groundwater, how do we use it, how much is there. They're reevaluating those to make sure that they're accurate. Last year, the governor initiated a water task force that was led by the state engineer. It was It was chaired by the state engineer, but I was on that task force. Several of our deputy directors were on that, our deputy cabinet secretaries. And it had government, it had private citizens, it had environmental groups, it had industry, it had a big group of people that sat down and they spent a year talking about what are the priorities, what are the problems, what are the priorities, what's the best path forward. And out of that came a bunch of recommendations that went to the governor and went to the legislature last year. And I'm happy to say that a lot of those they listened to, which is why I've got funding for water reuse, why the state engineers got the money to hire the staff and do these studies. You know, the understanding is there, and the funding is around right now too, with bipartisan infrastructure law and a lot of this other stuff. So we're positioning to try and take advantage of as much of that as we can. But I would not be doing my job if I was not willing to share the truth with people and be real. You know, we're not in a good spot. We're not going to be in a great spot in 5 years, but we can be moving towards a better place as we implement this stuff. Right. And that's what it's all about. This right here, having meetings like this, having folks that are interested in what's going on, interested enough to participate and ask questions is important, because we get through this as a community. And I'm talking about the whole state as a community. We get through it as a community. And that's crucial. So this just kind of gives you an idea of this picture. The top shows perennial versus non-perennial in the United States. You can see the purple, that's perennial. That's waters that are there all the time, right? And you can see how much of the United States is dealing with water that is not perennial. It goes away part of the year. So I say that, and I bring this up to say that this is not just a New Mexico problem either. And the Ogallala is a prime example. It was having problems for those farmers when I was a kid 60 years ago. And it's not any better today. A lot of those farms that were irrigated back then are now dry land if they exist at all. Right? And with the droughts and with the changes that are going on, and like it or not, we're seeing these weather patterns that become more severe and they last longer than we're used to. We're going to have to adapt as we go forward. And part of that's learning how to use this stuff better, how to protect the water, how to be smart. So let's talk about the wetland piece, right? Because that's really where it got people's attention with Sackett versus EPA. Although, to be quite honest, there was a lot more to it. It impacted more than just that particular piece of property. Now, that particular, let's talk a little bit about Sackett. As it turns out, you know, it was represented that they were private individuals who were wanting to develop their dream property and build a house on it. The reality is they were the property owners, but they're also a construction firm. They were developers and built other stuff. But we look at how much in New Mexico now is wetlands. And so as you can see here, about 482,000 acres, or 0.6% of New Mexico, is wetland. All right. That's about a 33% loss over the amount of wetland acreage that existed 200 years ago. Okay. So understand that there's man-made impact and then there's just nature's impact. As temperatures change, things change, you know. The thing about wetlands is that they provide critical wildlife habitat for birds, for all different kinds of things. Okay, I'm hoping we don't lose this connection. Maybe we'll be okay. I don't want to have to stand on the table with one arm in the air and my leg out this way and maintain it, but I will if that's what it takes to get this done. So right now, New Mexico, our acreage places us 34th in total wetland acreage among the 48 contiguous states, okay? They provide stopover and feeding areas for migrating waterfowl, things of that nature. Breeding grounds, they provide riparian streamside habitats that are important in maintaining the temperature of the waters. Right, and that becomes an issue if you're a fisherman, you know that if you're going after a trout that's a cold water fish and you pull it out and it's all mushy because the water's too warm, it's not good. And so the wetlands assist with that. Now, the ones that have got a direct connection to the river, they're not a problem, right? Because there's an actual surface, and so they're not at risk. But there's the other ones that have some kind of a separation that become an issue. Okay. For example, Playa Lakes that we have, in eastern New Mexico, these are not protected underwaters because they are not navigable and they don't float anything. But they provide necessary habitat for birds and other kinds of wildlife. They're critical. They create migratory corridors. And as I said, it's all the fishbowl concept. Everything is connected. I'm big on hummingbirds. I love it when the hummingbirds migrate in and stick around, and I try to keep them as long as I can. Drives my wife nuts sometimes. I'd keep a feeder out in the middle of the winter if it wouldn't freeze and if we figured out how to heat it. But they wouldn't be there. The issue is, though, we don't know as humans what we don't know yet about our planet. We think we know a lot, but every time you turn around, scientists find something that changes what they thought was a fact. Right? Or they find something they didn't know. We don't know for 100% what happens if those migrations stop. What else is impacted by the hummingbirds if they don't come through? What doesn't get pollinated? Does they actually work as pollinators? What happens? How does that impact us? It will have some impact, I guarantee it. So it's really all about the big picture. We have to keep that in our heads all the time. Wetlands contribute to flood attenuation, bank stabilization, and improved water quality. Our tourist industry benefits from it. You go down to the wildlife sanctuary down towards the coral and watch the waterfowl migrate in and out. That's amazing. If it dries up, guess what? They're going to be migrating someplace, but it won't be our neighborhood. So, talking a little more about the surface water and the impact to our communities, about 40% of our population depends on surface water for its drinking water supply to some extent. Santa Fe uses it, Albuquerque uses it, down south they use it, Chama uses 100%, Las Vegas uses 100%. There are other smaller communities that draw off of that water. So if it gets messed up or if it goes away, those communities are at risk. Just like the ones that are totally dependent on groundwater in eastern New Mexico, they're totally at risk. And so part of this is how do we develop other supplies, right? Now, of the surface waters we have, about 45% of them, the perennial surface waters, don't meet the water quality standards that we would like them to. They are in what we call impaired. Okay, that means they're either too hot or they have sediment in them a lot of times. Not necessarily chemical contamination, they can, but they're impaired in some way. And here's the unfortunate reality that the legislators don't like me sharing when they talk about this surface water permitting program, is that we'll stand the regulations up in 25. It's going to take us between 5 and 7 years to get the program fully operational. Right. That means that we're able to go out and permit everybody we want to permit. We're doing it in phases. That's the highest risk. I've got to figure out how to add about 35 staff to pick up over 4,000 permittees that will be dealing with. Okay. And they're just not walking around. I've got to hire them. I've got to train them. I've got to certify them before they can go do the job. The cost to run this program, $5 to $7 million a year. Right now, part of that could be paid. Actually, all of it could be paid with permit fees. Except I live in New Mexico, and so the reality is, you're not going to make that happen, right? And most of it, because some of these permitted facilities are gonna be fairly small. Right? They're not gonna be able to afford it. So now it's about convincing the legislature that they need to fund the program at a level where we can go protect that surface water. And not have a negative impact on those businesses. We don't want anybody put out of business. We don't want to hurt the mom and pops, but we have to protect our surface water. Emphasis on ours. Right? And so there's some hard conversations coming at all levels about what it takes to do this in New Mexico. You know, this fourth bullet down talks about the fixed amount of fresh water. Less than 1% of the water on Earth is actually available for human use. All right. That means that it is something that could be utilized in a reasonable manner. We talk about desal, there's been talk about desalinating ocean water, right, to use for drinking water stuff, and it's doable. There's science there, the mechanism is there to do it, but is it cost effective? Right now, most of us pay less than 2 cents a gallon for the water that comes out of our tap. That's pretty high. Most of us pay quite a bit less than that. What happens if that water, because of the cost of treating, is $1 a gallon? We might want to think about shortening our showers. Just saying. You know, now the reality is it costs money to do this. The other reality is we as a society got to figure out how to make it work. You know, how do we make it feasible to protect and promote life? And there's so many pieces to this and no easy answers. That's the problem. You know, one of the things, and this is why we're so cautious about pollution, this bullet talks about the fact that 1 gallon of gasoline can contaminate up to 750,000 gallons of water. Right? I remember when I was way younger, I worked as a volunteer firefighter. And having also a science background at the time, I did it because I lived in a small community and I wanted to be involved. I wanted somebody to show up if my house caught fire. You know, and so I figured I better be willing to do it for other people. But we had a truck wreck, right? And diesel spills out on the ground, and one of the other firefighters was getting ready to hose it down. And I stopped him. I said, "You can't do that. Right now, we got 100 gallons of diesel on the ground. You hit that with 5,000 gallons of water. We now got 5,100 gallons of contaminated fluid to deal with. So don't." And that's the other piece. We're having to learn how to do things differently. You know, PFAS, polyfluoral chemicals that are called forever chemicals because they don't break down and go away, were a big component back in the day in firefighting foam until they figured out what they do. And so now they're not used, but the problem still is present. And we're having to deal with that. And unfortunately, what we're finding as we sample is that you're going to get PFAS in water just about anywhere you look because it's so prevalent. If you use Teflon cookware, you're putting PFAS into the water because that's what Teflon is made with. Most of our furniture has some type of PFAS chemical utilized in the coatings and things like that. And nobody thought about it. It was a great idea when it started. I love Teflon until I figured out what it was doing. I'm not liking it so much anymore. You know, watch me get excited just whenever I watch you cooking in a Teflon skillet and half the coating is scraped off. No, time out. I don't want to eat that, right? Thank you very much. So this is another part of it. How do we stop the future contamination, ongoing contamination of our water sources? And then how do we fix what's already wrong? You know, uh-oh, I think I just lost connection. You might see if they can still hear us here. Give it a second, see if it.
There's another way to do this. It could be through me.
I love technology. Let's see if it'll come back up. Otherwise, you get this song and dance with no pretty pictures. Yeah, we lost the internet connection. Okay. It says it just popped back on. Well, we'll see. Yeah, it's not back yet. Is it?
There's a way to. Mine still seems to be working, so.
Yeah, it looks like it booted me out.
You're being too depressive.
I probably.
Here, maybe
I'm being censored, yeah. Well, can they still hear me online?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
Yes, we can.
well, then I tell you what I'm gonna do. You
Well,
won't
I
get
can-
pretty pictures, but I'm just gonna talk if y'all can hear me. 'cause
I
we
can
about-
share, I'll find a way to share.
Okay, we were right to the last of it anyway, so. And I provided this, they got that presentation, so they can feel free to share it. Put it on your website, whatever.
Okay.
So we're to the point of talking about now, what is NME doing to respond? And we've talked about some of this already. We're working on reg development. We're evaluating our existing regulations to see what we can use as protection for wetlands and things like that. And I'll give you an example. Several years back, under another rendition, when they changed WOTUS, the city of Silver City down in southwest New Mexico, they're in a basin, okay? So the water doesn't flow out anywhere. And so under that definition, they were excluded. They did not need a NIPDES, a National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit for their wastewater treatment plant. But you're in New Mexico. And New Mexico is one of the very few states in the nation that actually has water protection regulations for groundwater and surface water like we have. And so even though you don't need that NIPDES permit from the feds for Silver City, you have to have a discharge permit from our Groundwater Quality Bureau, right? To discharge the water out of your wastewater treatment plant. And we put conditions in those permits. And so what we did in that permit is we incorporated in the same protections for surface water that were in the NIPDES permit into that groundwater discharge permit to ensure that in that closed basin, we had that protection.
So if you want, we'll have the presentation.
Well,
They can see.
yeah, we can set it up there and then I'll talk. I'm not worried about them seeing me. I'll be honest with you, this is killing me to stand in one spot. Yeah, I'll share a little personal fact. I've been in this building before. Years ago, before I moved to Albuquerque and became a director for the environment department, I was an inspector, and in my spare time. There we go. In my spare time, it's fine. I was a licensed local pastor at the United Methodist Church in Mexico. So, and I love the fact that over there we had wireless mics, because I like to walk and talk. And I especially loved whenever somebody would fall asleep in the sermon to go sit down next to them. He was praying, and sit down next to them. I took a little getting used to. They got where they enjoyed it. So it's been a little tough being anchored for me. So we're looking at the permitting systems. We're looking at enhancing our groundwater regulations. We're looking at water reuse. We're trying to look at all aspects of how we protect the water we have and make it go further. And looking at new sources, looking at, with reuse, we look at alternative water sources, whether it's gray water reuse, whether it's reclaimed wastewater, whether it's looking at whether we can do something with water from the oil fields, whether it's brackish desalination. We're looking at all those aspects because we wouldn't be doing our jobs if we didn't explore every option, right? Even if some of them turn out to be no-goes, right? It can happen, but we've got to give it the honest effort, or I'm not doing the job that the taxpayers pay me to do. So that's our commitment, is that we're looking at all the options, and we're here to be part of the team to help this state maintain and grow. But I'm also here, and I'll just speak for myself, I'm here to have the hard conversations, because that's how we get to solutions, right? And I'm not the guy that's going to tell you what you want to hear. That was the way I was when I was a pastor as well. If you're coming to my church to hear what you want to hear, there may be a problem, because you may not hear it. Hey, if I make you uncomfortable, good. Because if you're uncomfortable, you'll think and you'll participate. And I don't care if you're mad, participate. We'll work through it together. So with that, we were very close to the end anyway, so here we are. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Yes, sir.
What's the potential for the aquifer under Albert?
So the question was, we're going to pass around the mic. The question was, what's the potential for the aquifer under Albuquerque? And I'm gonna have to give you an answer that I don't even like, and that is, we don't know for sure. That's part of the study that the Office of State Engineer is doing to figure out what we're working with groundwater. What we do know is that it's challenged in several areas. We have, fuel spill from Kirtland Air Force Base that they've been working on cleaning up. And a lot of that work, it's not cleaned up, but a lot of that has been targeted at not allowing it to go any further, right? Hold it in place and then figure out how we get it all cleaned up. It's not unlimited. I will tell you that. And there's risk all the time. My groundwater program, we have the state cleanup program, we have the voluntary cleanup program, voluntary remediation program, we handle Superfund. We have a lot of old businesses where we're now working on a program that this week is called the it's the Neglected Contaminated Site Program. And what it's dealing with is old dry cleaners, old mechanic shops that may have been out of business for 20 years, but when they were in business, they were dumping chemicals on the ground, and that's now contaminated shallow groundwater. We have plumes. Some of those are so bad that they become Superfund sites that the EPA oversees, but there's a whole bunch of others that don't meet that criteria. They still got to be cleaned up. And so we're scrounging money to go evaluate those sites, identify them, try and get them on the Superfund list so that federal money cleans it up. But we're also actively engaged lobbying our legislators and our supervisors and the governor to say, look, we need to actually develop a state program. We need money where we can go out and identify these sites and clean them up because people are at risk. And water resources are at risk. Groundwater is at risk, sometimes surface water. It's all over the state. I've got right now, we've identified 300 plus sites that fall into that category. And now we're trying to figure out how to go get the funding to make them happen, to get them cleaned up. So I wish I had a better answer. I'm hoping that in the next 12 to 18 months, state engineer does his thing, we'll have a really good answer, even if we don't want to hear it. Yes.
How much cooperation from the oil industry do you get when you work on the produced water there?
That's a good question, and I will tell you that we are actually getting a lot of cooperation from them right now, because it's in their best interest to find another way to dispose of this produced water. We engaged back in 2019 in what we call the New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium, which is a vehicle that New Mexico State University began under an MOU with us to do the science to figure out what can be done with this produced water. Can it be cleaned up to what levels, and what does it take to do that for fit for purpose uses? Nowhere in that fit for purpose are we even considering using it for drinking water or for livestock, for watering crops, right? We've identified somewhere around 1,300 unknown constituents in produced water that comes out of the Permian Basin down in southeast New Mexico that are going to have to be dealt with at some level before that water is usable for anything. So this is one of those that could be a no-show, could be a no-starter. We may find that the science tells us this is just not going to work. But we are moving forward with regulation that under the reuse regs that allows them to do closed loop pilot projects. And they're actively engaging with us to get that to happen, because they need to find some answers. But we're very strictly controlling that. It's, we're not willing to make some mistakes the first time. And letting the genie out of the bottle when it comes to that kind of thing is definitely one of them. So we're keeping it very controlled, but they are supportive. Matter of fact, I'm speaking at a groundwater conference in Albuquerque tomorrow, a panel discussion about this very subject. There's myself and 3 individuals from industry that are on that panel to talk about how we move this forward. But again, they understand there's no guarantees. The science may tell us can't use it, or it'll be limited use. Maybe it's in cooling towers. Where you recirculating it and it never gets out. We don't know.
We have a couple of questions from chat. Will the legislature finally start to fund these programs at the necessary level?
That's always the question that we deal with. There is more appetite right now to fund these programs than I have ever seen in my career. Like I say, we got 2.9 million from the legislature last year for water reuse, to develop water reuse. We got last session, we got 850,000. Before we got 600,000 for our surface water permitting program to begin to stand that up. We're going to be going back this legislative session, requesting special appropriations to add on to that. We've had to put on staff to deal with this, right? I'm dealing with, as a division, about a 35% vacancy rate right now. I have a couple of sections in bureaus that are full, but most of them are not. We have difficulty, and part of that difficulty is we're the state. We don't pay as good as private industry out there. We don't pay like Los Alamos, and so we lose staff all the time. And there's a shortage. When I talked about a shortage of operators for these community systems, there's a shortage of engineers in this state to support those systems. I've got engineering positions that have been open for 3 years, advertised. I cannot fill because there's nobody out there. And the private engineering firms, same problem. So not only do we have water issues, we've got support issues. I think the legislature is committed to doing a lot to get us where we want to be. I think we're going to see a lot of support this year again, probably more than I'm even asking for, for the state permitting program because they recognize the problem that happened with Sackett, with the voters rulings and stuff. The key is you got to do it right, you know, and it's not a quick process. You have to build the foundation first. Part of the conversation is New Mexico's known, our legislature is known for saying, build a program, show us it'll work, and then we'll fund it. So my conversations this last year with legislators have been, and from my background as a farm kid, if you want to harvest an ear of corn, you got to plant first, you got to water first, and then you reap the harvest. You want this state surface water permitting program, you got to fund it up front. I have to have the money to build the program out, and then you'll see the result. It isn't happening any other way. I think they're hearing it. But they, you know, it's kind of the old broken record deal. They hear it from me all the time. They need to hear it from other people. Because that's what's going to make the difference, right? And if other people are saying, and I'm saying that corroborates what I'm telling you, then we get somewhere. But it's a team effort, guys.
Another question from chat. Does the Orange County, California groundwater replenishment system have any applicability in New Mexico?
Potentially it does. Let me preface this by saying I am not bashful about taking advantage of somebody else's work. If it gets me to the end goal faster and for less money out of New Mexicans' pockets, I'm going to use it. So we're evaluating, like I said earlier, we're evaluating what Israel's doing with desal. We're evaluating what California is doing. We're looking at Colorado's new laws that they just passed with regard to direct and indirect potable reuse. We don't have time nor desire to reinvent the wheel. So we're going to cherry pick the best of everything to build New Mexico's regulations. And we welcome, I'll tell you right now, I welcome calls from people. I welcome somebody pointing me in a direction, hey, you might want to look at something. And so the end of the presentation, you didn't get to see up here, but it's in the presentation, is my contact information. By all means, reach out. You know, again, it's a team effort. We get there together.
One more question. Is it true that Texas wants to pipe produced water to New Mexico? Audrey Dunn said this when he was state lands commissioner.
So the truth is that New Mexico pipes millions of gallons of produced water into Texas every year. Texas isn't pumping it back to us. We're sending it there because Texas will allow them to inject into shallow wells. We will not. You inject in New Mexico, you can inject, but they're a deep well. We want it way, way down below any usable aquifer. Texas is putting it into shallow wells. That's why they in Oklahoma, who does the same thing, are experiencing all the seismic activity they're having. Now, we've been pushed by industry to allow injection into shallow wells. We're not allowing it. The Oil Conservation Division, which is part of the Energy, Minerals and Natural Resources Department, oversees that, and they don't allow shallow injection. And they don't intend to, which is why there's a lot of appetite on the part of industry to find alternative methods of getting rid of some of this produced water. You know, I will, and I gotta give them a shout out, because in the last 3 years, the oil and gas industry in the Permian has reduced the amount of fresh water that they use by about 60%. And they've done that by reusing that produced water in their injection processes. My perfect world would be where they reuse 100% of their produced water, and I don't have to worry about whether I can treat it well enough to use someplace else. I don't think we'll get there, but they're actively engaged in trying to make sure they're not using up our freshwater resources. And other ways to do this that is gonna, I mean, they're there to make money, right? They don't want to stop making money, but they want to try and do it in a manner that's not going to have a short-term impact and ultimately put them out of business. So again, it's a balancing act. But the reality is, at this point, Texas is not pumping any water our way, we're sending it to them. The question and the concern on the industry's part is, at what point does Texas say, we're not taking any more of that? Then there becomes an issue on this side, because we don't have that capability to get rid of all of it, so. Yes.
You mentioned Rancho Viejo, we use non-potable water for the open areas. But the new developments that are going in are not required to use non-potable water for their areas. They're using regular drinkable water. Why is that being allowed?
Because we don't have the reuse regulations in place yet that makes that mandatory. That's part of what we're working on. You know, we looked at having the first phase of our reuse regulations, which deals in depth with this produced water issue, because we need to get our arms around what they can and can't do quick. But we're fleshing out the other pieces, and one of them is going to be, do we build in those requirements? Now, some places like City of Albuquerque has the requirement. You do a development there, you have to put in what they call a purple pipe system. That's how you're supposed to be able to tell whether it's reclaimed wastewater or not, to irrigate your common areas and stuff like that. That is not a requirement in our regulations, but it is something that we are looking at putting there because it needs to be there.
What's it gonna take to get that?
Well, again, what that's going to take is, it's going to take public support. It's going to take involvement with our legislators. You know, as we move forward with these rulemakings, one thing I'll say is we don't do them in a closet. There's requirements. The way state constitution and the state statutes are set up. When I go to do a rulemaking, we have a public involvement process. We publish those meetings. There's opportunities for public comment. We welcome those comments. We actually try to reach out to target audiences to solicit comments from them, because we want that input. And that's where we can get that public support for these things.
But if we were, so you said Albuquerque has those regulations, so we're really talking Santa Fe, the city and the county.
Well, we're talking the whole rest of the state. Now, one of the unique things that people don't necessarily realize is that Albuquerque, the ABCWU, the Albuquerque Bernalillo County Water Utility Authority, is its own entity. And they have their own, they still have to meet federal regulations, but they oversee their own water and wastewater. We get involved if they violate something, and we have to come in as the state to enforce, but generally they set their own rules for the city and stuff like that. Santa Fe and Santa Fe County do the same to an extent, but there's issues with that, you know, and there's concerns about the ability to maintain the quality of that reuse water, okay? Because it's not raw sewage water that they're putting on there. They have to treat it, they have to disinfect it to a level that allows them to put it on a golf course, for example. There's certain conditions they can't spray it on there when there's people present. They have to do it, you know, during times when the public's not supposed to be exposed. They're supposed to have signage up that says it's not potable and stuff. I'm going to share a story with you though from the city of Grants, because the city of Grants, when I was over there, our wastewater treatment plant, we still got a nice 18-hole golf course, right? I used to fight with the city council because they would want to close that golf course down because it wasn't making money. And I'd have to explain to them, that's not a golf course. That's the discharge part of your wastewater treatment. You have to have it with that water. The fact that you can use it as a golf course and make $2, that's bonus. Man, that was a hard fight every year. And I say that to say, you know, we had the signage up. We did the same thing with the spray irrigation. We did everything right. And if you go out on the golf course in Santa Fe or in Grants, most of them, you'll see a ball washing station ever so often where you can put your ball in this box and crank it and it'll wash it, right? That's supposed to be potable water in that wash station. I cannot tell you how many times when I was out inspecting the golf course, because we went monthly to make sure that the systems were operating right, I would see golfers pick that ball up off the ground, lift it, put it down and hit it. And I'm like, okay, Somehow I need to get legislation that makes it illegal to be stupid. I have not managed to pull that off yet. And again, we're back to the hardest job in the world is protecting people from themselves. So. Yes,
Can you say more about the mapping project at the tech school? And what kinds of output they're going to have that will be accessible to homeowners?
it will be accessible, that, and I appreciate that question. That takes me on to one of my other favorite subjects, which is a few years ago, the state passed the Water Data Act, which forced us to start the Water Data Initiative. And the purpose of that is to make information about water and wastewater, all things wet, available to the public at a one-stop shop, right? Where they can go easily look and find this information. That is operated by New Mexico Tech, also by the Bureau of Geology. They are the lead on that. New Mexico Environment Department, Energy and Minerals, Game and Fish are all, and we're not even active participants, we are the lead organizations for that, actively involved in standing that up, which is why Tech is the one that's going to do this, the groundwater study, so that they feed that information into it. Now, I will tell you that the Water Data Act came across as initially a very much unfunded mandate. The old classic, here's what we want you to do, make it happen. If it works, we might pay for it. And so we have not moved forward the way we want to. There's a lot there. If you Google Water Data Act New Mexico or Water Data Initiative, WDI New Mexico, it'll get you to the website that they have stood up. And there's a lot of information there, but there's a lot more that needs to be. And this groundwater mapping plays into that, and it's going to be available there. Currently, you can see information on water quality for drinking water systems across the state. You can see information from Petroleum Storage Tank Bureau, because they have a lot of wells they put in looking at cleaning up contamination from leaking tanks. We have groundwater information. We don't have a lot of it because we're still dealing with paper permits in both groundwater and surface water. One of the big asks this year is the funding to put in and build a database to digitize all that information so that it is available to the public with ease and to us. You know, I can't tell you how many rooms of paper permits we have that we have to go dig through when we get a public records request or we go to do a permit renewal. We're only 20 or 30 years behind the times, and it's because it's not been a priority. It's becoming more one, but again, it's looking at this whole picture and helping everybody internally, externally, our legislators, our governor, understand that it's all interconnected. It all has to work together, and none of it works right.
Oh, the second question is the water task force that the legislature put together. Where's their report? I've been looking all over for it and I can't find it.
So the water task force report should be posted. It should be posted on the state engineer's website. It should be posted on the governor's website. I believe it's posted on the Environment Department website. If it's not and you can't find it, I'll be happy to get a copy and make it available. It's a public document. It's openly out there and available.
Okay.
You bet. You bet. Yes.
Thank you so much for all the information, and I love what you're doing. What can we do?
Well, I thank you. First of all, again, thanks for the opportunity to be here. And what's happening right here in this room, you're doing it. You're being involved to understand the problems and talk about the solutions. And as now I'm on thin ice because I'm technically not supposed to be involved when it comes to, elections and any of that kind of stuff. But I'm gonna say this is important enough. I'll get on that ice because you need to talk to your legislators. You need to ask them to be open-minded and listen to their constituents and to us, we work for you guys, right? About what has to happen to protect New Mexico. And it's not gonna be fun and games. I'll tell you, it's just not. I wish it was. But we can get through this. We will figure out a way to do it, but we do it together. And the key is, how long do we wait till we start? We need to get going now because clock's running. You know, and it may not be as real for us here in Santa Fe as it is for Roswell, New Mexico. But the clock's running. You know, and we're wanting to get ahead of it. We're wanting to do the things that need to happen. So that we can have this state for our kids and our grandkids and our great grandkids. Long after we're gone. But we gotta do the hard work now. So thanks so much for your involvement.
Thank you.
Thank you. You bet. My pleasure.
What town are you from?
So I was born in Plainview.
Okay, Leroy and Amarillo.
Okay, so yeah, you know the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Yeah, we are farmers in
You're gonna forget.
Plainview and Mount.